Welcome to Reputation Room. I'm your host, Andy Hallmark, and this is the place where we talk about what really shapes reputation in today's world. In public relations, I think people often think that the job is to spin, but the truth is, the best communicators are not spinning anything. They're helping leaders think clearly, speak honestly, and navigate moments that can define a company, a brand, or a career. Reputation Room is a place where we have candid conversations about leadership, communication, and the decisions that shape how organizations are seen and remembered. I am joined today by Kelly Brown. Kelly has more than 25 years of experience in communications roles at stops like NBC Universal and other global corporate leaders. She spent much of this time working in internal communications and has been deeply involved specifically in change management. She is a ProSci certified change practitioner, and that leads us into the discussion we're having today. So welcome to Reputation Room, Kelly.
Thank you, Andy. I'm so glad to be here to talk about the important role of communications in change initiatives.
Yeah. So, let's start right there, right? So when we talk about how important communications are in change management, change initiatives, a lot of times, I think a lot of people who are going into change situations don't think about the fact that they need to communicate well. So what's the role of the internal comms team or the communications consultant when it comes to this idea of making sure that communications are really embedded into your change initiative?
Vitally important. Change communications is built on a solid internal communications foundation, and if it's not in place, it needs to be put into place. Communications is the foundation for successful change. Whether you're using the ADKAR model or a different strategy, communications is how you build awareness, communicate the change vision, desire, knowledge, help their ability to change, and then reinforce the change long after rollout.
Internal communications by itself is not necessarily change communications. So there's this kind of thing where internal communications has to be a part of the change communication. Kind of describe that role a little bit, if you would.
Yes, sure. Internal communications are going to be the architect of the internal employee communications strategy, working very closely with senior managers, the CEO, the HR teams, L&D, even PR and marketing to ensure that both the formal and the informal communications that are rolled out are right for your change program, your change initiative.
You know, you and I both have had a chance to work in organizations where there were a lot of field employees. And it's important to take a moment here, I think, to talk about how you communicate during a changing situation to field employees, because it's different than what we do at corporate headquarters.
Absolutely. When communicating with the field, really about anything that's important, but especially a change initiative, face-to-face communications is vitally important, and from their most trusted source, which is their immediate supervisor.
I will say this though, you go to a site sometimes of any organization, and it's true that often I think field employees care about the site they work at, not necessarily the corporation as a whole. And so, how do you help field employees actually care about a change initiative when what they're really thinking about is, here's my job today, and it happens right here?
Well, that, first of all, making sure that the person who delivers the information to them is their immediate supervisor, because that is the person they trust the most, who will be armed to answer their questions, but also rooting that in their day-to-day operations in the organization that they're loyal to, which is their local work area, their teammates, and answering, of course, the what's in it for me. And
Sure. You have to answer that
reality.
question always, right? Always have to answer
You
that question.
always.
But when you think about middle managers or frontline supervisors, whatever you want to call this, why is that so critical during change? Because you can certainly get information to these employees through other means. So what makes that relationship so critical?
Well, they are the people who are also going to be coaching them, helping them change their behaviors, who can answer their questions, who also are a pathway to having additional questions answered or perhaps suggestions from the people who are Sometimes an engineer in a back office has devised a way to do something that when the field does it is not exactly the safest way. So ensuring that those suggestions are flagged up the chain, and also just knowing that the field experiences change through their manager, not the CEO.
I have seen CEOs, other leaders at the top who have often really wanted something to cascade down well. They have a good vision for what they want for the company, and they want it to get down throughout the organization. And then I've seen that go very poorly. And I guess the question I have here is how do you implement a strong manager cascade? Because you gotta make sure that what you're thinking at the top makes it all the way down to the front line and to those in the field. And that can be very challenging.
Great question. Manager cascades are also different depending on the audience. So with the corporate audience, you would develop the communications toolkits for the managers with the FAQs, talking points, whatever that they need. You might also do that for the frontline supervisors. But whereas you can cascade down for the corporate employee through middle management, you're going to cut them out for the frontline employees and have the senior most leader that is relevant for their work area communicate directly to the frontline supervisors, empower them with what they need, and go directly to the frontline employees.
But there is this problem of interpretation. Am I right? I mean, just because I always describe it as we sit around a table at headquarters and we come up with an idea of messages and things that we want to communicate, and then everyone nods and says, "This is really great. We're going to communicate this." But between that moment right there, when it's formalized, and what ends up being told to an employee, it's very challenging to keep consistency sometimes.
Definitely, often referred to as the middle muddle. That's where
Yeah, right,
communications
right.
toolkits come in very handy because you have the talking points, the FAQs. You can train them through sessions and actually role play, have them repeat it back to you. For the frontline supervisors, maybe a 3x5 card they can put in their uniform pocket that they can pull out that's very simply stated so that they have that information at their fingertips.
To further complicate this idea of change management, we also now have hybrid work. It's very common. And if not hybrid work, fully remote work. It doesn't matter. Either way, people who are out of the office regularly, I feel like in the old days, you would hold a big meeting and everybody would come to it and we would talk and, everyone got the same message. It's more difficult today, is it not?
Yes, whether it's fully remote or hybrid, you can't count on those hallway conversations anymore. So you have to be very intentional and purposeful in your communications, real channel discipline, understanding what goes out, which channel when, making those channels easily accessible to your remote employees or anybody working virtually. And that includes access to their manager, who again is a very, very critical source of information for employees.
Yeah, because you kind of have the same problem with a hybrid remote employee that you do with a field employee from the standpoint of if they're not hearing from someone directly that they trust, they're just not going to take the message, right?
Exactly. Oh, it has to come from a trusted source.
When I went to journalism school, we were taught, why, what, how. You had to answer these questions when you were putting together a story. And I feel like that we have to do the same thing when we're talking to employees. We can't just say blanket things when it comes to change. We have to give them a little more meat than that. Would you agree with that?
Yes, well, you have to make it relevant for them personally, for their job, for their work area. You have to communicate with them the who, what, when, where, why of the change, but again, always translating it to their local team or their work area. And you have to communicate often and frequently.
What do you do with a leader who just is not understanding this critical nature of needing to answer that level of question so that people can go ahead and say, okay, I'm on board with this change? How do you help them understand they cannot just say platitudes in these cases?
I think this is where the partnership through HR and making sure that the senior leadership, the very most senior leadership team, is on board with making managers and leaders accountable for communicating through change, building that into their goals and their performance, and then measuring that. And of course, ultimately, the ultimate measurement is, are the employees changing their behavior? That's what this is all about.
Yeah, I mean, there are times though that this doesn't go so smoothly, right? There are times when it just breaks down, and when that happens, and we've put together our change communications plan, and it's just not working. What do you see happen first?
Confusion.
Yeah,
Then you have assumptions. The rumor mill gets started, and especially if the leaders are not communicating anything, maybe they don't want to because they've decided they don't know enough, and they're just going to hold it till everything is certain. That rumor mill gets going, and the employees are going to communicate the change that's happening. And I think the question is, you have to decide is, do you want to be a part of it and actually lead the communications? Because the employees will begin to lose their productivity.
you know, uh, I think the way to avoid that is through discipline, right? We have a plan, we stick to the plan. When you think about kind of the most important things related to communications change, discipline, what comes to mind for you?
Treating communications as infrastructure, it's not an announcement, it's not 8 announcements, it's ongoing, it's built into everything. And for the informal communications for managers and frontline supervisors with their employees, if at all possible, building that into their daily conversations, maybe in up to four times a day, but making sure that you're constantly repeating and reinforcing that new change vision, expectations, and timeline.
I want to go back to what we talked about earlier, which was this idea that internal communications is not change communications, but they are interlinked. So practically now we've talked about what change communications is and the important pieces of it. How do we, tie that into what the internal communications team is doing?
They have to have real channel discipline. There is a tendency to want to throw everything out there through every channel, but you have to understand which channels are for which type of information, which message, and your audience. Know thy audience,
Yeah.
and meet them where they are.
Sometimes when we're in the midst of these big changes, and if there's been a series of big changes, might I add as well, I think that employees start to get overloaded a little bit. Managers who are delivering the messages start getting overloaded a little bit. How do you address that?
Well, the managers can help with that because they're going to be there to filter the information and translate it to their local meaning. Not everything needs to necessarily be communicated to their team at that time. They can pace out the information, maybe deliver it in chunks at a time. And then they can create space for employees to ask questions, which helps their teams and their employees with the information.
I think that we're contractually obligated to talk about AI adoption because it's because in some way or another it's going to affect any communications change management process going forward. So as it spreads, what challenges will leaders face related to AI adoption as well?
They're going to have emotional and utilitarian responses to AI. People who are going to be afraid that it might replace their jobs. So they need to provide guardrails, how to use it, what are the expectations, provide training and upskilling where that's relevant, and being sure that they talk to their employees openly and transparently about it.
And do you think that it plays a role also, even just curiously, even in the way that we build change communications? I think that a lot of communicators realize that they have to use AI, but it would be easy to get a little sloppy sometimes when using AI as well.
Definitely. It's very easy to just take whatever AI pushes out. That's where it's very important that you really understand best practices so that if you're using AI to help you, that you understand what is critical, what needs to be filtered out, and to whom to impart the information.
At some point, I guess we have to measure or evaluate, are we doing the job well when it comes to change communications? And leaders see numbers and they come away with different things depending on the leader. What should we tell leaders when it comes to evaluating change metrics?
I would tell them that metrics are not the entire story. Certainly, they are important, but there's more to it than that. And of course, the number one metric is have the employees change their behavior. That tells you a lot right there.
Well, but describe that a little further. When you say change behavior, I mean, are we talking like, hey, we're on board with this? Is it a slower process than that? I mean, you don't just roll out a 3 week plan and then everybody says, oh, I'm totally comfortable with this. How long does it take to get to a point where you see those metrics trend in a way that you're comfortable?
Of course, it depends on the actual change, how big it is, how drastic it is. But when you're talking about, say, anchoring a change in the culture, which is how we work, that you're talking about, in some cases, undoing thousands of hours of work that an employee has done. And that way of working is very ingrained. So they're not going to change after one 5 hour training session or one 2 week program, especially when you're thinking about anchoring it in the culture of the company. That takes a very long time.
I want to, no pun intended, dive a little deeper into anchoring it into the culture. So, what do you mean by that specifically?
Culture, people think a lot about employee engagement and are employees engaged, and when they're engaged, they're going to go for this change and they're going to do it. Engagement is really how we feel about how we work, whereas culture is the way that we work. So how we conduct a job, and that can be different in different places, and it really can be very detailed depending on the work that you're doing. So the culture and the job that they're doing, that's where a lot of the behavior must change. They're going to do their job differently, whether it's because of a new technology rollout or it's improved customer service, whatever it might be.
I think a lot of people would say, "Oh, well, we can figure out this change management thing. We can figure out," or they might not even think about it as change management. How do you convince leadership that we need to approach this differently than just every other communication that we put out there?
Because other forms of communication may have a different purpose. They may be there to build engagement, to simply inform employees about something they need to know, a benefit, literally like an HR benefit. But change communication is very specific. You're asking employees to change their behavior. And so how you go about that is a little different from just your day-to-day, everyday communications.
And we mentioned at the top that you are ProSci certified, and there's a bit of a process and a science that's been included in that type of certification and training, correct?
Absolutely. It's built on thousands of hours of research, and an understanding that change happens through people. And so it's learning, what do people go through when they have a big change? Change kind of has a branding problem. A lot of people don't really love change, even when they see that the improvement will be there and maybe life will be better. But it can be scary and it can be a lot of work. So you have to build that desire in them to change, give them the knowledge and the ability to conduct the change through training and other ways. And of course, reinforcing the good behavior and the change long after the rollout.
Yeah, I would argue that change communications has a bit of a branding problem as well, not just the idea of change when it comes to the employee, but I think there's a lot of leaders out there who see it as something that's too involved, that they don't want to get involved, that they don't want to do it. They say to themselves, that's just too much work for too little benefit. You know what I mean? We're in a culture, I think, right now where we want to get things done quickly and just kind of move on to the next thing. And change communication says just the opposite. We're not just going to move on to the next thing. How do you overcome that obstacle?
I think by making sure they understand that it's critically important, and it is the foundation of the successful change, just as it is in any good relationship communication. When you're talking about people changing whatever it is you want them to change, you have to communicate with them how to do it and the vision for that improved future. Make it very clear to them why it's happening, what's in it for them, and again, that can be the way you go about that might be different depending on the audience, but at least having conversations with a manager or frontline supervisors, direct employees, this is critically important to the success of the change.
I think you said something really important there. What's in it for them? It does seem like it's important that we let leaders know that, long-term retention is often bolstered by this idea of having change that occurs, but that is well communicated, that reaches even a stage of adoption for employees of what's going on, and that's less cost for HR. That's less cost to the bottom line. Wouldn't you agree?
Oh, it's a tremendous cost savings over time. What you might spend on communications, getting employees on board, being advocates for it, and then actually adopting the change will be far less costly in the long run.
Kelly, I appreciate the conversation we've had today. I know the next time I have a big change, I will call you and ask you how I should go about that. And I just hope that it's been beneficial for our listeners as well. Thanks for being here.
Happy to help. Thank you very much.